Aid and crisis response. My name is not working. My name is Brittany Perry Gomez. I am the Disaster Benefits Team Manager at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. I run a team of disaster attorneys and paralegals. We primarily work on FEMA appeals, SBA stuff, title clearing and long-term recovery, and all kinds of things like that. But in line with what this presentation is about, we also have used our disaster response experience in working in non-natural disaster situations. So unfortunately, Texas is in the news all the time for really terrible things, in addition to weather-related events. But I'm going to primarily be giving input and conversation related to the El Paso mass shooting and the Uvalde mass shooting, and how we adapted our program and our disaster response plan to respond to that kind of event. So I'm going to pass it over to Melissa.
I am Melissa Wagner. I'm a staff attorney at Legal Aid in Northwest Texas. I'm on our Disaster Legal Services unit. I am primarily going to be talking about our response to some wildfires that happened in the Texas Panhandle about a year ago, where an electric company came out and said that they could possibly be responsible for those electrical fires, for those wildfires rather.
Hi everyone, I'm Krista Figgins. I'm an attorney licensed in Florida, not in Oklahoma, which is ironic since I work and live in Oklahoma. But I'm the Director of Mission Advancement, and I also coordinate LASSO's disaster team. We have a 6-person staff full-time that does nothing but respond to disaster events. On average, over the last 15 years, Oklahoma has experienced a disaster event every 11 weeks. So we have 3 federally declared disasters going right now, and Oklahoma is on fire today. So we get a lot of experience with that. And I guess I will be speaking from probably the last 3 years of wildfires and tornadoes and floods. And
I think you mentioned there were some apartment fires.
Several, yes.
Fire everywhere.
Fire everywhere.
And then Jason.
Hello everyone, my name is Jason Susella. I'm the managing attorney of Bay Area Legal Services Disaster Relief Team. We are the local or regional legal aid provider here. It's been a pretty busy season. I'm sure that's not really a surprise. There's been some nasty visitors in town in August, September, and October. We also run the statewide disaster legal aid helpline, which is first point of contact for folks anywhere in the state seeking disaster survivors seeking legal assistance. Call in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about not our hurricane response, even though that's very much primarily what we do, but our response to COVID. COVID radically changed our program for a short time, so I'll be sharing insights on what we had to do to adapt to that, to better serve folks who are struggling in that situation.
Great. So if you were in here while we were getting ready for this, you know we're a really conversational bunch, and we like to talk a lot, but this is an open forum to also ask questions as they come up. We have some guided questions here. We may answer them, we may not. We might go on a completely different tangent. So we're going to kind of use it as a guide, but if you have any questions about what our programs have done or anything like that, feel free to raise your hand, and I will try to make sure that we address those questions. So first we're going to start, and I'm going to open it up a little bit to the group and ask, what are the key differences in the legal needs for a natural disaster survivor, someone who experienced a hurricane, a flood, a fire, versus a non-weather crisis-related event?
The biggest one to me that immediately comes to mind is with non-weather related, particularly man-made, you get a lot more questions about not necessarily FEMA, but dealing with private attorneys. And I got asked what, since we're legal aid attorneys, I never use this term, what contingency fee is normal for a private attorney to be charging? And I had previously worked in insurance defense, so I could answer that question, but if you've only done legal aid, that is a wild question to you, and you have no idea how to respond to that. And there's a lot of intricacies there in talking to people about dealing with private attorneys, which I know most of us are not. And so it is an area that does not come up in other disasters at all.
One thing that we experienced a lot in our program, there were the contingency fee questions, a lot of people coming in from other states wanting to sue rifle companies and things like that, approaching victims and their families. But on the legal aid side, something that we saw that was a really big problem for us was impacts on public benefits. You don't really see that a lot in natural disaster context because FEMA doesn't typically impact income-based benefits. There might be an occasional one-off where the system didn't work correctly, and that comes up. But after a mass casualty event, people get GoFundMes, people get donations from the community, they start getting money from wherever, people offering to pay for funerals, inheritance, all kinds of stuff. So that, while we're equipped to handle those issues, they come really quickly. And then the other issue we had in particular with our Uvalde response, because the victims were mostly children, there was a lot of conversation, and ultimately what they decided to do was create trusts for children. And that's an area that we at our program at Legal Aid don't really deal with. And so trying to figure out the interplay between creating a trust and also not losing public benefits and then putting SNAP on top of that, it was just a nightmare. All of the different programs had different requirements for protecting assets or just telling someone to spend it down and go from there. So that was a big question mark for us, and we learned pretty quickly, but it was a lot of work.
I would say we just we had an event several years ago where someone drove a car into the homecoming parade at Oklahoma State, and there were deaths and a lot of injuries, and we got a lot of criminal law questions after that, which we don't do that. So trying to make sure that we were able to connect people with the right folks that they needed to talk to within the criminal justice system in that county, so that they could get their questions properly answered, because that's just not in our wheelhouse.
Jason?
Are we on the second question?
Yeah.
Okay. I promise I'm paying attention. I'm not reading my text on my phone. I wanted to, I'm sorry, were you done talking?
I'm done. Go for it.
I'm going to say something a little different in the sense that some of the differences are not differences, but similarities between a weather event and a non-weather event. And what I wanted to say, like during COVID, one of the main issues that we have during hurricanes and during COVID was housing. And especially too with the unique situation of the moratoria, both in landlord-tenant law is what I'm talking about, and also real property, because again the moratorium on foreclosures as well. So we had to kind of retool to make sure that we were focusing on those particular items to make sure that folks coming to us were getting this information. We had to learn about exactly how these moratoria worked and everything, so people understood their rights very particularly.
That's a great transition into what models, or did you have a model or a formal response, and how you adapted your natural disaster response into this kind of response? So whether it be COVID, the electrical fires, how did that work?
So I'll say for our program, it required a pretty radical change in everything we did on a daily basis. Our disaster project stood up initially after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. We were originally stood up to provide assistance to survivors from those two storms. And we were real newbies and trying to make connections, figuring out the disaster relief community, which is quite different than anything else in legal aid. So trying to relearn all the partners, trying to know who you're talking to, trying to make sure you're getting a client pipeline, because survivors may not reach out to you directly, was all we were doing in the beginning. Everything was going well. We were slowly ramping up and making those connections, and then the rug got pulled out from under us. COVID happened. The world shut down. So one of the biggest things we wanted to figure out was how we could still remain active, right? You're not going to your VOED and COED meetings like you would. You're not communicating with your partners. Those events that you would normally go to are not happening. Community centers are shut down. How do you reach clients? How do you work with your partners? We had built up a bit of a network prior to that, so we just had to kind of shift over to understanding how we could engage remotely. So for example, we had recently stood up and rejuvenated the Hillsborough County COAD, which is Community Organizations Active in Disaster. I was the county liaison, meaning that if the Hillsborough County EOC activated, they had a seat in the EOC for that community liaison to sit there. So they'd drag me in there and I'd sit there like an idiot, not knowing what to do. But still, being the community liaison was important to communicate with COAD partners. The Hillsborough County Emergency Operations Center activated in response to COVID. But this was a very different thing for them because they activated remotely. They had very limited staff in that EOC. So I worked with them to learn their emergency management online portal, Web EOC, and I activated remotely. I would sit in front of my computer looking for missions to come in and such to try to communicate with COAD partners. This also worked in like, how do we do our outreach, right? Because we really can't go out to venues like we normally would in this situation. So we started to try to focus on what were the needs of the community, again, like talking about housing, education, both real property and landlord-tenant. And we made little online videos, ones that were digestible, ones that could be accessed just on a smartphone, and sending that out all through social media to make sure that our potential applicants and folks out there could easily access its stuff, didn't have to go to a special login portal, didn't have to go to an event, and could just bring things up on their phone. So, the list goes on about what we basically had to do, but trying to figure out how to run a disaster relief response entirely remotely was a bit of a challenge, but we kind of figured it out along the way.
We, in responding to El Paso, that was the first mass casualty event we experienced in our service area and actually responded to. So our service area in Texas is 68 counties. So we start in like Austin, which is in the middle of Texas. We go all the way to the Texas border, through the coast, and all the way up to El Paso. So there's a very big chunk of West Texas that kind of falls in there, Central Texas, South Texas. We just cover it all. And so one of the things we do on our disaster team, we have a written disaster response plan for our organization, but as a manager of my team, I have an individualized team plan. And so I have 4 paralegals that I work with, and their job is to do remote intake, or outreach. And so we sent them. We sent them to El Paso. We put them in hotels. The city set up a resiliency center, very similar to a DRC. Different players, but very similar to a DRC. And we were able to actually get into that. And if you know anything about what the events after a mass casualty situation look like, it's heavily policed, obviously. There's a lot of law enforcement presence, both state, local, and federal. And so getting into a resiliency center is really difficult. It's not kind of like a DRC where you say, hey, I'm a lawyer, I'm here to volunteer. It's you gotta know the players. And so we were actually able to use our contacts at the Texas Division of Emergency Management. So we actually called one of their reps, and she contacted the FBI, who then contacted the state troopers at the door who let us in. And so we were able to sit there and meet with victims and victims' families in that moment. And then we built a relationship with them. And then afterwards, there is an organization that comes in and kind of gathers all of the big community donations and creates an application for individuals to apply for additional financial assistance. We were able to explain to them why public benefits was going to be their biggest problem with dealing with our community afterwards, and basically have them refer anyone on the application who mentioned they had public benefits to our organization for advice about what to do when they get that lump sum of cash. So it looked like our natural disaster response model. We did the same outreach strategy. We sent the attorneys, we sent the paralegals, we met in a center with the survivors. It was just using the same partners to get in a different way and to meet with a different client community. So that's kind of how we modified that.
We had a very similar approach with dealing with the wildfires, in that they had essentially marks in these communities, multi-agency resource centers, and we were able to go to those and just table at those, and we also relied heavily on the Texas Division of Emergency Management, and from that actually kind of worked into incorporating them more with our natural disaster response. But I'd say like one of the things in that one that tried to be more cognizant of in modifying our response is that, like, normally with responding to some natural disasters, I don't worry as much about getting in the way, because usually by the time we're going up there for a mark or something, most of the responders and the response first responders have already been there. People have been pulled from the rubble, like they're almost in cleanup mode at that point. But with wildfires, like when I was in Borger, which is north of Amarillo, they were still fighting these wildfires. And so part of that was our service area is very large as well. We cover 114 counties. And so it was about like a 4-hour drive for me up there. And part of my thought on that was just trying to stay somewhere that was out of the way, like me personally. So I stayed in a hotel that was about an hour or an hour and a half away from where these marks were, just so that wasn't getting too close to where they were having active wildfires that they were still trying to deal with.
What partners did you find most critical, other than the Department of, we're giving an advertisement for TDM apparently, which they have their flaws, don't worry. But in addition to TDM, what other partners did you find kind of critical in helping after those wildfires with the electric company?
I was actually in Canadian last week. Honestly, local attorneys, and just kind of, those are very small rural communities, and so they don't necessarily have like massive organizations that are present in those communities. So it's mostly just smaller local groups. So in Canadian, I've been in contact with one of the local attorneys up there. And in Borger, I think we ended up getting connected with them through a church there in Borger. Churches are fairly good for knowing what's going on in their community and knowing where stuff like that is going on at.
Do you want to elaborate, Kristen?
I would love to. So Oklahoma has 77 counties. 59 of them are classified as rural by the USDA and the Office of Management and Budget. So that used to be 60. So, apparently Tulsa got a little bit bigger because now it's only 59. But people in Oklahoma refer to Oklahoma City, as if there's only one. There are, in fact, 3, but, that's what they say. So, but if you roll out from Oklahoma City to these really small rural communities and start trying to tell them they've got legal problems because of their disaster, they want no part of you. I mean, it's not like you can put a card table out, attorney present 5 cents or whatever. Like, they want nothing to do with you. So what we discovered by accident, really, there was a tornado in Elk City, Oklahoma, which is way out west in the middle of nowhere, and they had locked down the entire town. You could not get in without a pass. The sheriff was, had the roads blocked off. And I really knew that we needed to get out there. And I knew that we weren't, we're not lights and sirens. We're not first responders. We're not, going in with the canteens to feed people. So how am I getting into this community? And because of VOAD, and I will preach about VOAD all day long. If you do not belong to your state VOAD, please join it immediately. That is where you're going to meet all the people that you need to be able to be effective if you're doing disaster legal services, period, end of story. And if your legal aid is not involved in your VOAD, please talk to me because I will call and yell at them because they need to be. And I realize it's a funding thing a lot of the time, but anyway, you're not going to be able to effectively help people if you don't have good relationships within your disaster response community in your state. That's just how it is. But I called a friend in the VOAD, and I was whining about, how am I going to get into Elk City? She was the chair of our Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee, and she said, I'm going out there tomorrow to meet with the Ministerial Alliance. You should come with me. And I went there, and there were 12 ministers and faith leaders from every faith community within that area. And she said, tell them what you do. And I started talking to them, and they were thrilled to death because they had all their parishioners and the members of their congregations coming to them and saying, we have these problems. And they didn't know what to tell them or where to send them or what to do. But now that I had relationships with these faith leaders, they could introduce me to their congregations as a trusted friend of theirs. And that made all the difference in the world. I mean, I get goosebumps right now, honestly. You can see, just thinking about it, because it was like a light bulb went off. It's like that's how we crack rural Oklahoma, is through the faith communities. So we have spent the past 8 years doing trainings all across Oklahoma for faith leaders. We meet one-on-one, we do remote trainings, educational classes about, hey, we have the highest frequency of disaster events in the country, and you are going to be impacted, your congregations are going to be impacted if they are not already, and here's the information they're going to need, but we need you to help us get them to trust us, because we can't help them unless that bridge is made somehow. And that's what we've been doing, and it's been incredibly effective, because you don't realize how many touches a faith leader has in their community, how many people they talk to on a daily basis or a weekly basis. When you look at it, they have such a reach. It's crazy. I mean, you can effectively reach tens of thousands of people this way, and you're not going to reach a lot of these people any other way, because in rural Oklahoma, they've done studies. The first people that folks talk to when they have a problem, they go to their family, then they go to their friends, and they go to their faith leader. That's the order. So we have that training. If anybody's interested in using it, you're welcome to it. I'll email it to you. You can adapt it for your own state, but it's been a big help to us.
I was just going to add in here, for us, I think one of the predominant important partnerships was with local emergency management. So, and this is going to depend certainly, but in Florida, I have to contrast myself with these folks here. We have 5 counties that are as our direct service area, as opposed to like a million counties. No, we have 5. But they're 5 ones that you may have heard of. They are Pasco County, Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, Manatee, and Sarasota. There happens to be millions of people in this tiny little area. So we are super dense. So that kind of makes our landscape differently with how we work with this. But every county has its own emergency management group, and they have their own EOCs. Connecting with them, and this is also going to be highly dependent on where you are, because not every county and every state is going to have emergency management like this. But depending on how an emergency management agency is categorized, if they're an ESF run emergency management, an ESF is an essential support function, and they basically are little groups that focus on different aspects of disaster response and recovery. In your emergency management, there is going to be a volunteer and donation ESF. That's ESF 15 here in Pinellas, ESF 15 in Hillsborough. Those are the folks who want to talk to you from emergency management. They're the ones who connect with your local VOAD and COAD. They're also very good because when you never know exactly who's going to show up for a disaster, especially a non-weather event. It could be a variety of partners you've never heard of before. When they come to town, they're not going to probably come to you. They're not going to be like, we need to find those lawyers and talk to them. They know what's going on. They're going to go to the county. They're going to say, county emergency management, we need to deploy. Where are your points of distribution? What can we do? And if you are connected with the county, and again, like Chris has said, you're VOAD and COAD. And again, in some states, you have just a statewide VOAD or COAD, which we have a Florida VOAD, but we also have very small centered VOADs. We have Pinellas VOAD. We have Hillsborough COAD. And these are very important local groups that can connect you with partners. But let's just say you didn't know those folks prior to it. If you know the county, if the county knows what you do, they can connect you with these groups who are coming into town to provide assistance, which again will in turn help you connect with survivors. Because again, as legal aid sometimes, survivors don't know to come to us. They just think they're having these various hurdles in recovery. They are not self-identifying that they have a legal issue. So, having sort of a foundational connection through this can help you connect with these partners who are ultimately going to be the most important folks you're talking to along the way.
Yeah. I'm going to switch it up a little bit. And so we've talked about some of the positives of working with VOAD, COAD. What are some challenges unique to non-natural disasters did you experience in your coordination? So, for example, with us, after Uvalde, and, well, really after Uvalde, but also in El Paso, the private bar gets involved in natural disasters, but usually they want to help with FEMA, and then they kind of stay around for a little bit and then dissipate a little bit. But after our mass casualty events, we had an overwhelming response of attorneys who wanted to assist. And so for us, we had to take on, we have a pro bono coordination side to our organization, but we had to take on a massive influx of volunteer attorneys who were actually trained in an area we could use them for. So there was no training on a new area of law for them. So in El Paso, because a lot of the victims were adults, we needed a lot of probate work done and a lot of intestate work done. And so we worked with the El Paso Bar Association to get that done. And it ultimately turned out to be a really great partnership, but that massive front load of getting the coordination and bringing in the legal aid attorneys and the probate experts, and we did a full day CLE of probating an estate, probating the estate of a low-income person, probating the estate of an immigrant. Like, how do you do this? What do you do with the Mexican consulate when you have a person? Because in El Paso, people come over, work for the day, and then go back home. So there was a lot of different factors there. And then after Uvalde, same thing, less of a response for probate because, unfortunately, those victims were children. There was a lot of heirship determination that had to be done. There were a lot of family issues going on. We had immigration issues because there's a border checkpoint not far from Uvalde. But I think overwhelmingly one of the bigger issues that we saw were private attorneys coming in, and we had some barratry issues that the state bar had to kind of step in on and say, you can't keep approaching people and asking them if they want to sue. And also, who are you going to sue, right? And so we had that. And I know, Melissa, you mentioned briefly that was also an issue after the electric company wildfires. Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah. So the first, I don't think it was technically a MORC, but the first, resource fair I went to in Borger, I'm sitting at our table for Legal Aid in Northwest Texas with a couple other paralegals and another attorney, and an attorney is up walking around these tables handing out his card. He worked for a firm based in California, but that had an office in Houston that specialized in suing electrical companies after wildfires. And I didn't even know you could specialize in that, but that just speaks to how many wildfires they have in California. Bless their hearts. So, and he hands me his card and says, well, you can point people towards me. And I'm thinking to myself, no, I can't do that. And he's walking around talking to these people, and on some level, you have people come up to you and ask you about that, and you can be very honest with them because they've just been through a wildfire, and you don't mind telling them, hey, probably don't talk to that guy right now. Just steer clear of that. But at the same time, I don't want to have issues with this or something. So thankfully, at one point, the church we were at kicked that guy out. So I was very thankful for that. But it's very difficult you want to work with these other attorneys and you want to incorporate them into your response, especially since legal aids, we only have so many attorneys and we turn away a ton of applicants just because we don't have the resources to cover all of those. So you want to work with these attorneys, but a lot of private attorneys, unfortunately, walk around just, and it's their nature, they walk around trying to see what they can actually make money off of. And approaching people whose house has just been destroyed by a wildfire while they're talking to a food bank probably is not the best time to do that.
One of the issues that we had, and this was, I say, a little bit more primarily in weather-related events when we have DCMs, disaster case management, come into town. Your partners are going to eventually know what you do. It's always good to educate them on legal services, but they're going to send people over to you who need help when they, confidentiality. It's an issue. It can be very frustrating to organizations that don't listen to you and don't understand the attorney-client privilege. So, when you need to make sure to try to educate your partners in advance, because once they are set up, once they're talking to survivors, and once they're identifying potential applicants for you, you want to make sure they know, like they send it over to you, and it's going to be a bit of a black hole. That's what it is. They're not going to be able to call you up to say, hey, what's going on with Mr. and Mrs. Smith's case? Please tell us. How's that FEMA appeal going or whatever? And like, can't tell you. That's not what it is. So I think that's been a little bit of a hurdle, but again, you can sort of get over that by making sure to just do your best to educate these partners coming into town about what you do and what your limitations are on these sorts of things.
Krista, I'm going to ask you this one.
Okay.
So how does Oklahoma Legal Aid make sure that the services y'all provide are trauma-informed and culturally competent?
Well, we bring in outside trainers, generally. We wrote it into a couple of our grants that we had psychological first aid training. We had question, persuade, refer, QPR training, and in any kind of area where we think we need to make sure the entire staff, and it wasn't just the disaster staff, like we required all 300 of our staff people to take these courses, just to make sure that folks knew that you are dealing with people who have been traumatized, and I think that's useful for legal aid attorneys in general. I mean, a lot of our clients, if they're disaster impacted or not, have been traumatized. So I think it was beneficial across the board. But yeah, we brought in a nationally recognized trainer and had several classes that we held over about a 2-month period, and we try to keep sending out more materials that are recommended and whatnot, and we try to refresh that every year, every 2 years, so that folks have that, because a lot of the time you can have a client in your office who's breaking down right in front of you, and what do you do, and who do you call, and what are the resources in your local community, and so we try to make sure that everybody knows what those resources are, so that they can help that client in losing crisis.
One of the strategies we took on at TRLA in helping not only us but clients navigate the process. So the first thing we did, kind of going towards that trauma-informed, culturally competent piece, is we have social workers at our organization that work with our family law, domestic violence team, and there's a handful of them. And a lot of them are licensed professional counselors as well. So one of the things we did, in addition to the disaster paralegals that I have that are already trained in all of the things that Krista was saying and go out to these areas frequently, is we incorporated the social workers into that outreach, so that in the event someone wanted to open up or tell their story or something like that, there was someone that was trained and able to handle a situation like that. And then internally, something that I think we learned from El Paso and we didn't do there, and we learned that was a bad thing and we needed to do this time, was we held a very small kind of like check-in for the paralegals, for the social workers, and there were 3 main attorneys working on all of these cases. We tried to keep it small to kind of lessen the impact on the organization of how emotionally tolling some of these cases were. which I don't know if that was the best thing to do, hindsight 2020. Maybe we'll expand a little because it is a lot of work, but it's also just really sad work. But we held this office hours like every Friday, and we let it be a time where the individuals who were doing outreach could just kind of vent about whatever they saw or what they saw on the ground. So sometimes they would ask questions like, hey, this situation came up at the Resiliency Center, it was a little weird, or maybe they asked a question, they didn't know how to answer it, so we could do, practical logistical stuff. But then sometimes they were saying like, this mom came to me and I had a really hard day and it was terrible. I took a lunch hour, longer than I probably should have, don't care. I need a day off because this is too much. Perfect, great, approved, moving on. And so it was just really this place for them to come and vent and speak. And we actually brought in our team manager over our social workers. So she oversaw all of that. And if they wanted one-on-ones, they could do that as well. So I thought that was a really creative thing for our organization to do. I think in the future, maybe we'll bring an outside person in to moderate some of those conversations. But we tried, and I think, unfortunately, we learned from El Paso. We did not do something like that. It was very difficult on our El Paso staff. So we tried to get a little better this time. Hopefully, we do not have another opportunity to also revise again. But and then for strategies in navigating, our clients navigating these systems, we actually created a mass casualty event toolkit. And it's used...
It's amazing.
Thank you. It is actually used to train legal aid attorneys on how to help clients after these events. So there's a ton of one-pagers on there about how to help sort through public benefits, how to work with the National Compassion Fund, how to help people apply for CVC, what U visa procedures might come up when you're dealing with clients and things like that. So there's a ton of resources. And so our way in helping clients navigate this is, one, there's a toolkit on there about financial, where they can maybe get some assistance in the short term. But really it's training the legal aid attorneys to make sure that they can kind of alleviate some of that burden for the victims and their families. So we're going to, I think I already changed this slide.
No.
I did. I lied. Okay, so we're going to transition into equity and access. I'm going to open these questions up to the whole group. And this is some of this stuff is more built into how legal aid generally works. But what steps can legal aid providers take to ensure that you're providing equitable access and assistance in the aftermath of an event like this?
I mean, the obvious answer is to just make sure that whatever community you're going into, you are covering all of the cultural populations that are in that community. This wasn't a man-made disaster, but we responded to some flooding in Amarillo almost 2 years ago. And Amarillo, I think it surprises a lot of people, has massive immigrant populations in it that come to work at meatpacking facilities. And so I think the Amarillo School District has to translate things into something like 15 different languages or something like that. So kind of just being cognizant of that and realizing that you may have people approach you who do not speak the same language as you, and being able to work with your translating lines, whatever you have on that, or bringing over staff that speak the language that they are speaking.
And I can, this is like a privilege here because we have a smaller direct service area. We can get a little granular about making sure that we're reaching folks who may not be able to reach out to us. So we partner, for example, with Stetson folks and USF, University of South Florida, who have resources, and they have departments that are focused on identifying vulnerable communities regarding disaster resilience, disaster response. So in them knowing what we do and pairing with them, we're able to have a better idea of where some of these vulnerable communities are. Also, your social vulnerability index, your county partners may have data like that on hand that you can have shared with you to give you an idea of pinpoint communities in your area that you should be focused on conducting outreach, having community events in there for folks who may not have easy access to transportation. So those data sets, from partners who have those resources is very helpful to sort of guide your outreach efforts to make sure that you're reaching folks who, again, may not be able to reach out to you.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think, again, as soon as this is over, I have two VOAD meetings back to back to talk about wildfires, and one of the things we will be talking about is this very issue. What are the vulnerable populations within the vulnerable populations in the areas that have been impacted? Because if I don't know, somebody else is going to. I mean, we had a bunch of tornadoes last April and May that got declared, and it impacted an area that's around the Oklahoma School for the Deaf and Blind. And that, there was a large population of folks there who their primary language is ASL. And so they were having trouble communicating, and there were a lot of legal issues, especially landlord-tenant stuff that was coming up. Strangely, two of my attorneys are fluent in ASL, so that worked out, for us, and we were helping other people. But that's something that a lot of our organizations within our Oklahoma VOAD will bring up is, please understand, there's a large, Vietnamese population in this area. Oklahoma was a large resettlement center after the Vietnam War for Catholic Charities and Lutheran Social Services. So a lot of those agencies know, what challenges there may be within specific areas, and are very, very quick to identify those, so the rest of the response community in Oklahoma can address that. And then we work together, to do that. If I don't have a resource, somebody else does. And I think we do have a mobile unit now as far as transportation issues, because that's a huge thing for us, especially in rural areas. You've got to go to where people are. So we have a mobile office unit that has 2 offices. We can sleep in it if we have to. It's basically a big camper, and we roll that out and try to get to the areas where people need help because they can't get to us.
I want to touch on this question up here about racial and economic justice considerations. One thing about Uvalde that is very cool, not the event, the city, is that it is a very small town, but it has a very rich political history, and the fact that it has a lot of advocacy points. So the community back in, was it like the 60s or 70s, there were multiple staged walkouts from students based on not being treated appropriately in schools, a huge Hispanic community talking about not getting language access in schools, and the community itself kind of took it upon themselves to advocate, stage these protests and things like that. And so after Uvalde, a lot of those original organizers still are in town, and they started to motivate and reach out to families because if you remember, there was a massive law enforcement response, which meant there was lots of video footage of what was happening, and the state locked it all down. Nothing was coming out about what happened in the response, the videos, nothing like that. And so this advocacy group of parents and former advocates from those protests got together and staged protests across the city, ultimately forcing the state to release these videos and do an in-person watch with the families, with law enforcement present, and then force them to answer questions on the spot about what happened, why did you make these decisions, what's going on. So we were able to kind of work alongside that group in some of the outreach work we did and getting information passed out to the community and kind of getting them on our side and us helping them and providing those legal services. And I think, we used to have an office in Uvalde before the pandemic. During the pandemic, we ultimately had to close a couple of offices, and unfortunately that was one of them. So there was a little bit of distrust there within the community about legal aid and why are we coming back and things like that. And so having that group on our side kind of saying, no, we can trust these people, they really are here to help, was a huge part of our response effort. So I thought that was interesting. So we're going to transition to lessons learned, and then we'll wrap up because we only have a couple minutes left. But how do you see the role of legal aid evolving in crisis response over the next 5 to 10 years? And maybe how do you see, or how would you like to see it evolve over the next 5 to 10 years?
I would like it to become more organized, more like knowing what to do the way that we kind of approach natural disasters. A lot of the man-made ones, we don't know what to do going in, and we kind of just fly by the seat of our pants. And I would kind of, because there are things that unfortunately have become things that we very sadly can't expect. Like I'm from Texas, I can expect more wildfires. We sadly live in a society where we have to expect shootings. So it's very, like, it's sad work, and it's, like, just playing into the worst possible scenarios. But I think they are things that we need to be thinking of when we make these crisis plans.
That's a good point. We incorporated, after El Paso, a shooting active response into our COOP plan at our organization, just because you never know. Trista, Jason?
I think that number one, it's a funding thing.
Right.
Right now there's no Legal Services Corporation funding at all for any disaster after 2022. So the funding for 23 and 24 was pulled from the CR at the end of last year before it passed. So there's not an LSC funded program in the country that has any money for 23 or 24 right now. So if you can't find another way to pay for this work, you may not be allowed to do this work. And that is a horrific problem, I think, because folks who are disaster impacted, as we know, low-income people are disproportionately more impacted than any other group. So when I see a disaster client at legal aid, not only am I looking at a legal aid client, I'm looking at a legal aid client who's now been more disadvantaged than the average legal aid client, which are already really, really disadvantaged. So if this is not a priority, if this work is not a priority of your organization, that makes me crazy, because I think, is it family law? It could involve family law, but it's not the area that people traditionally think about when they think about legal aid. But I think it's some of the most important work that legal aid does. Maybe that's because that's what I do, but that's really what I think. Because after working in legal aid a long time, then actually accidentally ending up responding to an EF5 tornado in 2013 that changed the course of my career forever, these people were in such a bad way, much worse than any family law client I'd ever worked with at a legal aid before, So I think making this work a priority is important within your organization, and funding is a big part of that. And we are going to have to figure out how to pay for this work, because if we can't figure out how to pay for it, they're not going to let us do it. And that would be horrific, I think.
Jason?
I'll say real quick, just to sort of supplement what Chris was saying here. Funding concerns aside, more and more, we are seeing legal aid being like a fundamentally necessary part of disaster response. We are inseparable. We used to be the outsiders. That's not the case anymore. And we go beyond just providing legal services. Let me give you an example locally here. Do you know who runs the Pinellas FOAD, who the chair of the Pinellas FOAD is?
Yes.
Yeah, it's John Lawless. John Lawless is my coworker, the chair of Pinellas FOAD. Do you know who the chair of the Hillsborough COAD is? It's John Lawless. Do you know who's standing up the long-term recovery group in Pinellas and Hillsborough counties? The long-term recovery group, the group that is in charge of coordinating long-term resources for a couple of counties that were extremely devastated by Helene and Milton, and Debbie too, let's not forget. The chair of that long-term recovery group is Jason Susella. He's sitting here, by the way. We are doing things very non-traditional, but as we integrate into the disaster relief community, we can identify gaps. we're not like stepping on people's toes saying we want to be the ones to do this. We are stepping up because there is a lack of those, what champions you want to call them. We are trying to fill gaps to make sure that we have some sort of coordinated response. Legal aid also has this unique ability because a lot of partners come into town after a disaster event, right? They set up, but then they demobilize once immediate triage is conducted, right? They're out of there. So you're left with a gap, right? Legal aid, if the funding goes the way it has in the past, remains active, right? Our statewide disaster line remains active the entire year. It doesn't come up and go down, come up and go down. So it becomes this consistent resource that people know, and us who are continuously funded to respond to disasters, keep going to the meetings and all this and that, and are known, is a reliable resource that's going to always be there. So again, the way legal aid participates in disaster recovery, disaster response is fundamentally different and goes much, much further than just helping clients with their legal issues.
And it's primarily important. I mean, in Oklahoma now, state emergency management, the only group allowed in a FEMA DRC in Oklahoma other than FEMA is legal aid.
Yep.
That is the only agency that they allow in there, is us. So, I mean, our partners know how important it is. FEMA knows how important it is, that we're there because they understand that everybody gets a much better outcome, if that's the case. And, maybe I need to be hitting up Red Cross and Sal Army for money.
We're doing it.
I know you are.
Yeah, we're
We're
going
to have to talk about that. So.
And like the Pinellas VOAD has a community liaison seat in the Pinellas Emergency Operations Center.
Right.
That's Jason Susella. After Helene, I got a call from my ESF lead saying, Jason, can you come in? You got to work a few 12-hour shifts. And I did. And they feed you like several times a day. It's great. It's wonderful. But either way, I don't think we ever expected one day, we'd be sitting in the EOC. We'd be doing those 12-hour shifts along all the other emergency managers. But again, these are gaps in the community that are really need to be filled, and legal aid happens to be filling them too. And we're not the only one doing this. So this is,
So we're out of time, but if you have questions, I know I saw a handful. Feel free to come up and ask them, or stay where you are and ask them, whichever you prefer. But everybody can go if you want or stay. But thank you so much for coming. I hope this was interesting and a little bit. It's a little bit different than what you normally see at a disaster conference. But I hope everybody was able to learn something. And feel free to reach out to any of us. Oh, it goes to 12. Oh, never mind.
Oh, cool.
We have
Thank you.
8
Don't say that.
Okay, never mind. You all have to stay for 8 more minutes.
Don't miss lunch.
Yeah, you must stay now. You're required. Okay, so we can open it up to questions. I saw that you had one.
I had actually 2 comments. One is about what you're saying, how legal aid is so integral to the disaster recovery process, and it's a kick in the pants about the funding because I feel like for the first time outside agencies are really recognizing it.
Yeah.
And after Helene hit, the New York Times called and was like, "How is legal aid dealing with this?" And it was like for the first time ever nationally, it was like legal services is right there, and then we didn't get the funding, which is wow. And then the second point is, if you're an LSE funded organization, there is a memorandum of understanding with the Red Cross, and in North Carolina we have a first of its kind partnership, and talk about no one else is allowed in a place. No one else is allowed in a place. So the Red Cross shelters, legal aid of North Carolina was allowed in, and we got to meet with people, the most vulnerable, the most homeless, vulnerable people who were disaster survivors. And so I would recommend that you do call the Red Cross and try to get that partnership up in your state. Because it's there.
Go ahead.
I just had a comment, and I think that you touched upon something that's really, really important, and that is that a safe and healthy community has to be made a priority for the legal services programs. And we did it maybe a couple of years ago, but I'm starting to see now that in terms of getting grant funds, if it's a stated priority, then you stand a much better chance of getting someone who funded it. This is a priority for your organization. So I think going to the board and making sure the board of directors understands that they need to approve safe and healthy communities as a priority.
Yeah, I agree. I think our organization, Krista's organization, Jason, and Landway as well, there are not as, we're all very lucky, and our organization has standing disaster response teams all the time. And it is a priority within our organization. And we haven't had a really bad disaster in several years. But our organization still prioritizes this. Yeah, knock on wood. But our organization still prioritizes this work. And so I think you're right. If the funding's there and you can advocate that on your board and make sure to promote that, it's really, really important because as you see, it impacts everything. Go ahead.
Do you see, I mean, like, we're always reactive.
Right.
And it's 6 months before the grant comes out after the disaster.
Yeah.
And we don't have standing people. And we're trying, do you guys have any suggestions on how we can lobby people to get more money for that standing?
Yeah, I can't lobby because I work for an LSC organization,
Well,
so. But Stephanie, our preparedness queen here, works for Disability Rights Texas, who can lobby. So
Okay, still a gray area,
Yeah.
but one of my biggest beefs with LSC is it is retroactive, right? You have to have that declaration before you're even option to get money. That's part of the problem.
Yep.
We have to get funding beforehand to do more preparedness and build that resiliency to ensure we're included in long-term recovery, VOAD, legal aid, or whatever it is, because this is not going away. And part of the problem is that legal aid is after the fact. If we want to promote access to justice and continue to have lack of resources, we have to be involved in blue sky times. Chasing the grease pig after the fact is not working. And we've got to figure out how to lobby and fill that stopgap. A lot of times it could be funding from the state level. California's got options and programs to do that. Of course, they also had a $1 billion lawsuit, right? But we've got to figure out how to find that funding outside of other standing channels. Private firms, private equities, and stuff like that.
One of the exceptions to the rule against LSC programs lobbying is to lobby for your own funding. That's an exception, and you can do it as long as you use non-LSC funds to lobby.
There's
for
a
your
big
funding.
debate on hold funds and unrestricted, but yes.
So I will say
leeway, but yeah.
one practical thing that doesn't involve lobbying is actually the organization who is hosting this wonderful conference here, Equal Justice Works. They have a Disaster Resiliency Fellowship. I came from that fellowship. I was the first year around. We have a bunch of fellows in here. Hannah, who was on the last panel, was on that fellowship. And they come with private funding. So if you can get your hand on one of those fellows, then that's how you can kind of start to build that without having to use LSC funding right away. The other thing I would say is when you have a fellow, or if you have someone who's able to work on this work committed, is to have them build the response plan, the infrastructure within your organization to make sure that you can respond faster, right, with or without the funding. What our organization has started to kind of do, it's a little bit new for us, is the funding for the disaster grants come late. They just do. And sometimes they're a year late.
18 months.
Yeah, it just depends. So we started doing reimbursements from LSC. We use LSC basic funding. We spend that down. We keep really good accounting of it. And then when they come to say, do you want to apply for a project-based grant or a reimbursement grant, we've started choosing reimbursement as an option.
Are we being recorded?
Huh?
Are we being recorded?
Maybe.
I'm just gonna
I
say.
think so. I think so.
I'm a
we're
pretty-
gonna go.
I always like to joke. I'm not joking. Do it anyways. Just call it something different. Call it outreach instead of doing a preparedness event. Things like that.
Yeah.
You know, there are ways to get around your funding language to still be legitimately providing resources, because you have to do it. It's an integral part of disaster responses to already start on preparedness stuff for the next one. Like, do it anyways. And you know, that's of course like a resource constraint, but don't be scared of your funding sources to say like, no, don't use the term preparedness. Okay, then don't use the term preparedness. Use other words, but still do the same thing that's going to help the community.
You have a question?
How much funding could you get from the LSC disaster grants, and what's the outlook for those grants over the next 4 years?
We only have
Like,
1
so
minute.
I work in the CR, like is that like pretending that like maybe they won't exist for 4 more years, or like what do you think?
I think it's grim.
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
grim at this point. You can ask for whatever, and if you can back it up with your accounting and everything like that, a lot of it is retroactive. So you have some of the case numbers and things like that to prove when you're asking for it from LSC for LSC to then go and ask Congress. But who knows?
I guess basic field grant funding is